Tonight, if you are listening to this story while the room around you has grown quiet, when the lights have softened and the outside world has begun to recede, try to imagine an old map spread across a wooden table. Not a map of the familiar borders we know today, but a Europe still divided, fragmented, and convinced that the world ended just beyond its own edges. At the beginning of the 13th century, much of Europe did not look eastward with curiosity or vigilance. It saw the East as a vague blank space, a land of rumors, of names difficult to pronounce, and of threats believed to be too distant to ever become truly real. Yet beyond the vast Eurasian steppe, a completely different system of warfare was already in motion. Not loud, not chaotic, and not accidental. The story you are about to hear is not meant to replay shocking images, nor does it seek to mythologize war. This is a slow journey, meant to guide you gently towards sleep, into what truly happened when the Mongol armies entered Europe, and why what remained afterward was not ashes, but a quiet awakening. Let that map unfold. Let time slow down. And begin with a Europe that was not yet prepared to face a world larger than itself. If you were to stand on a hill in Central Europe at the beginning of the 13th century, the first thing you would notice would not be strength, but fragmentation. Before you would not lie a unified continent, but a patchwork stitched together from hundreds of small pieces, duchies, kingdoms, lordships, bishoprics, city-states. Each piece had its own laws, its own armies, and above all, a very clear sense that whatever lay beyond its narrow borders was not a responsibility it needed to concern itself with. For most of the time, war for them meant familiar conflicts, repeated again and again between neighboring lords, sieges that lasted several months around a stone city, or campaigns that were more symbolic than destructive. War had its rhythm, it had its seasons, and most importantly, it had limits that all sides implicitly understood. Fighting to gain land, fighting to claim succession rights, fighting to assert honor, but rarely to erase the opponent's entire structure of existence. In that world, power was organized vertically, like a many-layered tower built over generations. At the top stood the king, bearer of supreme authority and name. But his power did not flow directly to the battlefield in a continuous line. Every command leaving the royal court had to pass through thick layers of intermediaries, dukes, counts, local lords, before it ever reached the knights and soldiers who actually held the spear. At each level, the order could be delayed, reinterpreted, or even ignored if it did not align with the immediate interests of the recipient. Feudal relationships were not a pure chain of command, but a network of personal obligations. A lord swore loyalty to the king, yet at the same time owed duties to his own family, to the land he governed, and to the knights who had placed their honor under his banner. When war broke out, the first question was not always, "What must we do for the kingdom?" but often, "What does this war bring to my lordship?" Obedience, therefore, was never automatic. It was always accompanied by calculation. Knights, the very symbol of European military power, also fought within a framework uniquely their own. They were trained to protect personal honor, to keep their oaths to their immediate lord, and to assert their standing in a social order where prestige mattered nearly as much as life itself. On the battlefield, this produced acts of courage, even heroism, but rarely produced coordination on a large, systemic scale. Each group of knights fought as a unit of honor, not as a component of a single, unified war machine. The absence of a centralized command structure meant that warfare in Europe remained highly localized. An army could be raised quickly to meet a nearby threat, but coordinating multiple forces across different regions required time, letters, messengers, and above all, political consensus, something that did not always exist. When information traveled more slowly than armies, responding to a rapidly changing threat became nearly impossible. That information system reflected the rhythm of the age itself. News moved on horseback, along dirt roads, across territories that were not always friendly. A letter could take many days, even weeks, to arrive, and by the time it did, the reality on the battlefield might already be entirely different. Each region, therefore, lived within its own sense of time, reacting to war based on information that was already outdated the moment it was read. Within such a structure, war was not imagined as a continuous flow, but as a sequence of discrete events. A battle in the north did not necessarily trigger an immediate response in the south. An ally's defeat could be seen as their problem, not as a signal of a shared danger. This lack of connection was not merely technical, it was conceptual. Europe was not yet accustomed to the idea that a threat very far away could rapidly become a threat to everyone. For this reason, vertical power provided stability in times of peace, but became heavy and slow when faced with a form of warfare that demanded speed, coordination, and immediate reaction. It created a world where everyone had a clearly defined place. Yet no one was responsible for the whole picture, and in such a world, when a force operating according to an entirely different logic appeared, delay was not merely inconvenient, it became a fatal vulnerability. This produced a false sense of security. When there was no single common enemy, when every threat appeared local, it was easy to believe that the world could continue functioning as it always had. Rumors from the East, when they reached monks or royal courts, were often grouped together with other distant tales: strange tribes, harsh lands, people living outside Christian norms. They were recorded in chronicles, but rarely treated as serious warnings. Europe's military structure clearly reflected this worldview. The focus of warfare rested on the knightly class, warriors trained to fight in relatively confined spaces, with clear objectives and familiar opponents. Heavy armor, large war horses, and direct cavalry charges were symbols of strength. Yet that strength was tightly bound to terrain, weather, and the ability to sustain logistics within a limited distance from home. War, as they imagined it, was not a flood, but a series of predictable collisions. European cities were built according to the same logic, a logic shaped by centuries of confrontation with familiar enemies. High walls, deep moats, narrow gates were not merely physical defenses, but crystallizations of a very specific belief that war would unfold in predictable steps. An enemy army would appear on the horizon. They would camp outside the city's range. They would begin a siege. And from that moment on, the clock of war would slow down Daily life in Europe at the time followed a slow, clearly cyclical rhythm, anchored to land, seasons, and familiar relationships. The economy was largely local. Peasants lived and worked around their villages, rarely traveling more than a few days away. Food was produced first to sustain the community before any thought of trade. Markets followed fixed calendars tied to religious festivals, and prosperity or hardship was felt seasonally, not through rapid fluctuations. Cities, though centers of trade and craft, were not yet continuously operating economic engines as they would later become. A city prospered through familiar trade routes, through predictable flows of people and goods. When war broke out, commerce was expected to slow, but also expected to return once order was restored. This economy was built on the assumption that disruption was temporary, and that the world would soon return to its familiar equilibrium. In this familiar scenario, time was the defender's greatest ally. Each day behind thick stone walls was a day the attacker had to consume supplies, maintain morale, and endure disease and weather. Cities were designed to endure, not to counterattack. Grain stores were stockpiled for long months of isolation. Wells were dug deep to avoid dependence on outside water. Streets were narrow and winding not only for civilian life, but to slow an enemy who might breach the gates. All of these elements reflected a deep belief that war was a prolonged struggle, where endurance mattered more than speed. Europeans were accustomed to the idea that space could be controlled with stone, and time could be controlled with patience. A good city was one that could hold out long enough for the enemy to withdraw, or for relief forces to arrive. In this mindset, war was not a continuous flow, but a sequence of fixed points, each anchored by walls and siege rituals. As a result, Europe's defensive architecture was not designed to confront extreme mobility. It assumed that the enemy would be bound by the same constraints, forced to stop, to wait, to exhaust resources over time. Few imagined that an army might choose not to besiege, not to wait, not to interact with cities in traditional ways. Few imagined warfare that could bypass these anchor points entirely, leaving behind intact walls that had become strategically irrelevant. Thus, European cities before 1241 resembled fortresses built to defend against the memory of the past. Rather than to confront an unknown future, they were strong, resilient, and deeply loyal to a single assumption: that war would always give people enough time to adapt. And when that assumption was challenged, the very walls that had once provided safety exposed a difficult truth: that not every war intends to stop at the gate. In this context, Europe did not lack courage. What it lacked was something more important: the ability to imagine a different form of warfare. There was no concept of an army that could move faster than information, no concept of a force that could strike in multiple places simultaneously while remaining coordinated, and certainly no concept of an enemy that treated information, psychology, and organization as weapons equal to sword and spear. This fragmentation existed not only between kingdoms, but within thought itself. Early 13th century Europe still viewed the world through a powerful religious lens. What lay outside the familiar order was often explained in moral or theological terms, rather than through strategic analysis. An unclear threat was easily dismissed or attributed to metaphysical causes rather than concrete reality. And then familiarity itself became the weakness. When you grow accustomed to one kind of war, you build everything to confront that kind of war. You train soldiers that way. You build cities that way. You write laws and customs around it. But when an entirely different form of warfare appears, all of that preparation can fall out of rhythm in a very short moment. What is striking is that before 1241, there were signs, reports of distant clashes. Strange armies with unfamiliar methods were recorded sporadically in chronicles, but they arrived unevenly, unclearly, and were never connected into a coherent whole. No one assembled the fragments because no one believed it was necessary. Europe at the time did not lack intellectual life. Monasteries preserved texts. Schools taught philosophy and theology. But that knowledge was oriented toward understanding the world as it had long existed, not toward anticipating structural change. When history moves slowly across generations, people tend to believe it always will. Thus, in hindsight, what made Europe vulnerable was not weakness, but confidence built on old assumptions. They believed war could be managed. They believed enemies would follow familiar rules. And they believed that if a threat became serious enough, they would have time to respond. But history does not always grant time. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a force that does not share those assumptions, a force unconcerned with familiar rhythms, unbound by mental borders, and unwilling to treat war as a series of isolated events rather than a continuously operating system. Europe before 1241 stood on the threshold of such a moment without realizing it. Everything appeared normal. Lords continued their disputes. Cities continued reinforcing their walls. Courts continued looking nearby rather than far away. There was no urgency, no preparation for something beyond historical experience. And within that normalcy, a gap emerged. A gap between how Europe understood war and how another power was preparing to wage it. A gap invisible to the eye, existing in thought, organization, and unquestioned assumptions. When we look back on this period, it is not to judge or condemn. These people were neither foolish nor passive. They were living in a world where the scale and speed of change lay beyond imagination, and history, as it often does, chose that precise moment to turn the page, a page on which Europe would be forced to learn, very quickly, that the world was not only larger than it had believed, but governed by logics entirely different from those it had relied upon. And that was the context, the ground, upon which the encounter with the Mongols would unfold, not as a catastrophe from nowhere, but as a severe test of every assumption Europe had carried for centuries. To understand why the encounter between Europe and the Mongol armies produced such a profound shock, we first need to step away from the familiar images of Western medieval warfare. We need to enter a different mental landscape, one in which war is not seen as a sequence of isolated battles, but as a continuously operating system, where organization, information, and tempo matter no less than raw force. The Mongol army did not emerge from cities, nor was it tied tightly to fixed lordships. It was born from the steppe, an environment that forced people to think differently about space and time. There, distance was not measured by administrative borders, but by how far one could move in a single day, a concept both flexible and harsh. because it was directly linked to the endurance of human beings and horses. The steppe has no clear boundary markers where you can stop and say the journey has ended. It has only water points, grazing grounds, and horizons that keep opening outward without end. In that landscape, time carried a different meaning as well. It was not divided into fixed agricultural seasons tied to sowing and harvest, but felt through shifts in weather, through the movement of herds, and through subtle signs in the environment that only those who had lived there for years could recognize. A prolonged drought, an early cold wind, or a shortage of grass could force an entire community to move immediately. Decisions could not be postponed, because delay was not merely inconvenient, it could mean loss. That rhythm of life forged a mindset in which mobility was normal, not exceptional. People of the steppe were accustomed to carrying everything necessary for survival, and to the idea that today's shelter might be abandoned tomorrow without regret. This created a very different relationship to space. Land was not owned in a fixed sense, but used for certain periods of time, according to need and natural conditions. When that mindset was brought into war, it produced an approach radically different from that of long-settled societies. An army did not need to protect fixed structures behind it, because it did not depend on them to survive. It could advance far, change direction, or withdraw without being bound by the traditional idea of losing land. The space of war became an open plain, where position could shift continuously without undermining the stability of the system as a whole. Time, in that context, was also used as a flexible tool. The Mongols were accustomed to acting quickly when conditions were favorable, and waiting when the environment demanded patience. They did not need to follow rigid schedules, because everyday life had already taught them how to read nature's subtle signals. A campaign could be accelerated or slowed depending on water sources, the strength of the horse herds, and the ability to sustain long-day movement. To early 13th century Europe, where space was organized around lordships, city walls, and fixed ownership, this way of thinking was almost unimaginable. There, long-distance movement always came with logistical rupture, with the risk of losing control, and with the fear of being unable to return. For the Mongols, by contrast, continuous movement itself was what guaranteed safety and effectiveness. This opposition was not merely geographic. It was a difference in how people understood their relationship with the world around them. So, when the Mongol army entered lands where war was tied to fortresses and borders, it carried with it a mindset forged in a place without clear boundaries, a mindset that treated distance as a variable to be adjusted, and time as something that could be bent to the needs of the campaign. That mindset, more than any weapon, created a gap between the two worlds about to collide, a gap that did not exist on the map, but in the way each side imagined war, and even its own existence. At the core of the Mongol military was an organizational structure of remarkable clarity and consistency. The entire force was divided according to a decimal system: 10 men, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. The importance lay not in the numbers themselves, but in the operating principle. Every level had a commander directly responsible, and orders moved down through a short chain with few layers, leaving almost no space for arbitrary reinterpretation. Individual responsibility was tightly bound to collective outcome, producing a level of discipline that Europe's feudal armies rarely achieved on a large scale. Contrary to popular imagination, the Mongol army was not a chaotic crowd driven by sheer ferocity. It functioned like a single body, in which each small unit could operate independently while still remaining connected to the overall campaign. A cavalry detachment could be separated for reconnaissance, harassment, or psychological pressure, and then rapidly rejoin the main formation without breaking the larger structure. That flexibility did not come from improvisation. It came from training and preparation long before war truly began. Another key factor was how the Mongols regarded information. For them, information did not come after war. It was a prerequisite for war to occur. Before a major campaign was launched, routes, water sources, terrain, and the enemy's likely responses were gathered, verified, and memorized. That information was not stored in complex written records, but held in the collective memory of commanders, continuously updated through scouting groups that moved faster than any enemy army. Within that system, speed became a form of power. Mongol forces could travel farther in a day than European armies considered reasonable. They were not wholly dependent on cumbersome supply trains, because each rider carried multiple horses, rotating mounts to preserve the herd's strength. This allowed them to maintain a steady tempo over long periods without stopping for extended reorganization. To opponents accustomed to slow marches, fixed camps, and clear supply lines, that speed felt like facing a force that always arrived before news could. Mongol tactics reflected the same systemic logic, one that did not center on a single moment of glory, but on a process of gradually stripping the enemy of the ability to control the situation. They did not view war as a stage for individuals to prove themselves under the gaze of their peers, but as a chain of calculated actions designed to break the enemy's way of thinking and reacting in that approach. A decisive battle, in the traditional sense, was not the objective. It was only one of many outcomes that might occur after the enemy's structure had been weakened long enough, rather than concentrating all force on one point. Mongol armies often sought to stretch the enemy's formation, forcing them to divide their strength to meet threats appearing simultaneously from multiple directions. Once the formation was extended, communication became fragile. Orders arrived more slowly. Decisions began to rely on guesswork rather than complete information. In that state, the enemy no longer fought according to the original plan, but reacted instinctively, trying to patch the gaps opening up around them. Calculated retreats, often misunderstood as signs of weakness, were in fact part of regulating the tempo of war. By withdrawing intentionally, the Mongols controlled distance, held initiative in space, and observed how the enemy reacted when they believed they had the advantage. Every advance or retreat carried the purpose of gathering more information, not merely avoiding combat. War, in this view, became an ongoing experiment in which the opponent was forced to reveal its weaknesses. Dispersed attacks served the same purpose. They were not meant to annihilate immediately, but to create the sense that danger could appear anywhere, at any time. When the enemy could not determine which direction was primary and which secondary, they were compelled to disperse attention and resources. Constant shifts in tempo, fast, then slow, made prediction difficult and caused plans built on rigid schedules to collapse. What matters is that these methods were not the product of impulsive battlefield decisions. They were the result of a military tradition accumulated over many generations, tested across vast spaces and under harsh conditions. The experience of war was not stored in books, but transmitted through training, practice, and the collective memory of those who had taken part in earlier campaigns. Each generation of commanders did not begin from zero, but stood on lessons paid for with time and survival. The selection and training of commanders reflected that philosophy. Leaders were not chosen only for lineage or personal connections, but for proven ability in real conditions. Promotion was tied to results on the battlefield, to the ability to keep a unit functioning effectively amid rapid change. This produced a leadership class accustomed to making decisions without perfect information, and accustomed to coordinating forces across vast spaces where small mistakes could bring large consequences. This combination of accumulated tradition and merit-based selection helped the Mongol military maintain consistency in action, even when campaigns stretched on and unfolded across many different lands. Commanders shared a common language of war, a shared view of goals and means, making coordination far more natural than among forces assembled from units with different cultures and motivations. To medieval Europe, where war was still deeply marked by personal honor, this cold, systemic mode of operation created a gap that was difficult to comprehend. It was not always visible to the naked eye, because it did not always reveal itself through large battles, but in the quiet intervals, in movements that appeared scattered. The Mongol army steadily eroded the opponent's ability to control events. And when the final moment of direct confrontation arrived, it was often no longer an even contest between two forces, but the end point of a long process in which the balance had shifted long before. In that context, figures like Subutai were not merely generals in the traditional sense, but thinkers who approached war as a large problem of space and time. Campaigns were planned in multiple phases, with the capacity to adjust flexibly as conditions changed. A thrust did not need to achieve immediate victory, as long as it contributed to the broader objective of weakening the enemy's ability to respond at the political and strategic level. Leaders like Batu Khan represented a model of authority different from Europe's feudal order. Their power did not rest only on bloodline, but also on the ability to keep the system functioning smoothly. Major decisions were made based on information gathered from multiple sources and implemented through a machinery accustomed to coordination across great distances. Another crucial difference lay in how the Mongols understood the objectives of war. For them, war did not necessarily have to end with permanent occupation of every land they passed through. A campaign could be considered successful if it achieved a specific strategic goal, weakening an alliance, breaking the enemy's capacity to mobilize, or forcing territories to restructure their defenses. This explains why many cities and regions, even if not occupied long-term, still found themselves thrown into deep instability after the Mongols withdrew. The combination of tight organization, reliable information, and high speed created a kind of war Europe had never experienced. It did not allow the opponent time to adapt in familiar rhythms. Decisions had to be made faster than political deliberation could keep pace. Local responses became isolated when faced with a campaign designed as a connected whole. More than that, the Mongols did not treat war as an exceptional event, but as part of an operating order. They prepared for it as they prepared for a long journey, with different scenarios already considered in advance. This created a gap not only in military strength, but in worldview. While Europe still thought of war as a temporary disruption within an otherwise stable life, the Mongols were accustomed to living in continuous motion, where rapid adaptation determined survival. That difference meant the coming clash was not simply a battle between two forces, but a collision between two systems of thought. One side believed in slowness, in walls, and in time. The other believed in speed, in information, and in keeping the enemy permanently chasing. When those two worlds met, the outcome was not determined only on the battlefield, but also in how each side understood or failed to understand the nature of the war it was entering. And that is why, even before an arrow was fired, before a battle was recorded in any chronicle, the balance had already begun to tilt, not because one side was more brutal or more courageous, but because one side had prepared for a different kind of war, a kind of war the rest of the world had not yet realized already existed. Before the Mongol armies appeared on the fields of Central Europe in 1241, before names like Hungary or Poland moved to the center of the chronicles, there was a much earlier moment, a quiet moment, rarely noticed, yet decisive in meaning. It was the year 1223 when Europe first touched the edge of an entirely different world of war. Without realizing it had just been placed on that world's map for the Mongols. The westward movement in the early 1220s was not a campaign of conquest in the traditional sense. It did not carry the objective of permanently holding territory, nor did it come with the intent to restructure the politics of distant lands. Instead, it resembled a reconnaissance on a vast scale, a journey meant to observe, measure, and remember in their way of war. Before a land could become a battlefield, it first had to become data. This reconnaissance unfolded as the Mongols were expanding their influence powerfully across Central Asia and the Caucasus. Moving west, they encountered groups that Europe tended to refer to collectively as the Cumans and other nomadic coalitions. For the Mongols, these clashes were not merely military collisions. They were opportunities to watch the chain reaction, where the tribes fled, whom they appealed to for help, and what alliances would form when pressure arrived from the east. In the Mongol way of conducting war, information and reconnaissance were not supporting tools. They were the nervous system of the entire campaign. If military strength was muscle, reconnaissance was the network of sensation that allowed that body to know when to move, when to stop, and in which direction. Without it, even the most mobile force would become blind and slow before an advance was set in motion. Those who went ahead had been present for a long time. They did not only observe terrain, they listened to the rhythm of life in the communities they passed through. They memorized routes, water points, grazing lands, and places where horse herds could be sustained for many consecutive days. But no less importantly, they observed people, how territories reacted under pressure, how quickly forces could be assembled, and how much coordination existed among local leaders. Each small detail, placed beside another, gradually formed a living picture of how an opponent would behave once war truly began. That flow of information was not choked at some distant central hub. It moved quickly through flexible channels to those who could use it immediately. This allowed commanders to adjust plans while the campaign was still unfolding, rather than waiting for the outcome of a battle already finished. When the opponent changed position, the campaign changed with it. When one route became difficult, the direction of advance was altered without disrupting the entire structure. Meanwhile, for many European forces of the same era, information often arrived after the fact, in the form of rumor or delayed reports. The gap between observation and decision was long enough for opportunities to slip away. This disparity made the Mongols seem as though they were always one step ahead, not because they knew the future, but because they could sense the present more clearly. In that mode of operation, information was not something stockpiled to prove foresight. It was used to sustain the living tempo of the campaign. It allowed an army to behave like a living organism, continuously sensing its environment and adjusting its responses. And thanks to that nervous system, the Mongols could move across immense spaces without losing orientation, apply pressure in multiple places without becoming scattered, and withdraw at the right moment without turning retreat into chaos. If you place the Mongols' reconnaissance system beside the messenger system of contemporary Europe, the difference does not lie in human courage, but in how information is treated. For the Mongols, reconnaissance was a continuous process, woven into the movement of the entire campaign. Those who went ahead did not bring back only news of positions or numbers. They brought back an overall sense of the environment, of response speed, hesitation, and the gaps in the enemy's structure. Information was gathered to be used immediately, and its value lay in arriving at the right time, not in being perfectly complete. Europe's messenger system, by contrast, operated according to a different logic, one suited to a stable, fragmented world. Messengers were sent to deliver orders or report an event that had already happened, not to continuously update a situation still changing. News traveled from one point to another along fixed routes, and often reached the recipient after the reality on the ground had already shifted. The gap between knowing and acting, therefore, was always stretched by time and procedure. This difference produced two entirely opposing tempos of war. The Mongols acted within a living stream of information, where decision and movement were tightly bound together. Europe, on the other hand, responded to scattered fragments of information that arrived late and often in hindsight. When those two tempos collided, the advantage lay not in numbers or bravery, but in the ability to sense the present in that confrontation. One side always knew where it was, while the other was still trying to understand what had just happened. Seen this way, the difference was not merely a matter of military technique, but of mindset. One side treated information as something that comes after war. The other treated it as the condition that allows war to exist at all, and in the coming clash. That understanding would shape the tempo of an entire continent. It was within that chain of reactions that the Rus principalities and allied forces of Eastern Europe entered the picture, faced with a threat they had never seen before. Local princes attempted to gather forces in the familiar way. Meetings were convened, Messengers were dispatched. Armies were assembled from many different lands, bringing with them differing customs, tactics, and expectations. Everything unfolded in an atmosphere that was urgent and yet lacking clear direction. For Europe, that mobilization looked like a legitimate response to danger. For the Mongols, it was a perfect experiment. They could observe how different forces coordinated or failed to coordinate with one another. They could measure the speed of assembly, the ability to maintain discipline on the march, and the degree of dependence on individual leaders. More importantly, they could test how their opponents reacted when pulled out of their familiar tempo of war. The clash on the banks of the Kalka River, therefore, should not be seen as a decisive battle, but as a temporary endpoint in a long sequence of observation. The Mongols did not enter it with the intention of destroying Europe, because at that time, Europe was still not the strategic objective. They entered with the intention to test the enemy's ability to pursue, to test how Allied forces held formation when stretched out, and to test psychological responses when events did not unfold as expected. What followed, recorded in scattered form in various chronicles, was often told in the language of defeat and chaos. But if we set aside the specific details of the battle, what becomes more striking is the structure of the event. The Allied Rus's forces and their partners were drawn into an unfamiliar tempo. They advanced, believing they were pressing the enemy. They extended their formation, gradually losing communication between wings, and when they realized the situation was not what they had hoped, reorganization was already too slow. For the Mongols, that moment yielded a vast amount of information. They had seen how European forces reacted under pressure. They had noted dependence on personal honor and on the roles of individual leaders. They had understood that breaking the rhythm of command could produce a cascading effect faster than wearing down forces in direct confrontation. And most importantly, they recognized that the world to the west was still operating on old assumptions about war. After Kalka, what confused many Europeans was the Mongol withdrawal. There was no occupation, no attempt to exploit victory to expand control. For a European mindset in which war was typically tied to territory and concrete power, such behavior was difficult to interpret. An enemy who fights and then leaves could easily be treated as an abnormal episode rather than a sign of long-term strategy, and could even create the impression that the threat had passed. Yet that withdrawal was precisely what completed the reconnaissance. For the Mongols, there was no reason to remain once the objective had been achieved. They had gathered sufficient information. They had identified routes that could be used in the future. They had understood the political and military structure of the lands to the west, as well as the inherent weaknesses in how those forces coordinated with one another. Continuing deeper at that moment offered no benefit proportionate to the cost. What matters is that after 1223, Europe did not treat Kalka as a strategic warning. In many records, it was mentioned as a local catastrophe associated with distant lands at the edge of the familiar world. There was no serious attempt to analyze the enemy more deeply, no large-scale military reform, no fundamental shift in how war was understood. European life continued along its old rhythm, with familiar internal conflicts and unchanged political priorities. Part of that indifference came from the era's own information structure. News of Kalka spread spread slowly, through many layers of intermediaries, arriving in different places in different forms. Key details were blurred. The wider context was narrowed into a story of the defeat of a few princes. There was no analytical center strong enough to assemble the fragments into a unified strategic picture. But more deeply, that indifference reflected a problem of perception. Europe was not ready to believe that a distant force could take an interest in them in such a systematic way. The idea that Europe had been placed on the map of another power so early ran against the centrality Europe still felt about its own world. To acknowledge it would have meant acknowledging that old assumptions about security and distance were no longer valid. For the Mongols, meanwhile, Khalkha was not an ending, but a note in a longer plan. The lessons of 1223 were not filed away into storage. They were carried, transmitted, and integrated into later campaigns, when the Mongols returned to the West nearly 2 decades later. It was not the first time they entered that space. It was the second, with memory, with data, and with an understanding far deeper than what their opponents possessed of them. So when we look back at the 1223 reconnaissance, what stands out is not the fate of those who fell, but the disparity in how two worlds process the experience. One side treated it as a lesson to remember and prepare, a sign that the world ahead was wider and more complex than previously known. The other treated it as something that had passed, a local disaster on a distant frontier of familiar order, not strong enough to force a change in thinking or organization. For the Mongols, the experience of 1223 did not end when they left the battlefield. It continued to live in the collective memory of commanders, in stories told around campfires, in small decisions adjusted for later campaigns. What had been observed, how the enemy assembled forces, how they reacted when formations were stretched, how information broke down under pressure, became part of a shared storehouse of experience. The Western world was no longer a vague blank space on the map, but a space that could be anticipated, with behavioral patterns that had been tested in Europe. By contrast, the memory of 1223 gradually faded amid familiar concerns. Courts continued to struggle for power. Lords continued to defend local interests. Internal wars, taxation, and succession consumed the ruling class's attention. There was no mechanism to turn distant experience into shared strategic learning. Each land remembered in its own way, and then allowed the memory to dissolve into the background of local history. The gap between these two ways of seeing did not immediately reveal itself through major events. On the surface, the world still looked calm. Trade routes continued to function. Cities continued to build and reinforce their walls. Life returned to familiar rhythms, where war was treated as a temporary disruption rather than a systemic threat. That prolonged normalcy made the sense of safety feel stronger and gradually weakened the ability to imagine a large shock. But in that quiet, two currents of history were silently moving farther apart. One side accumulated information, adjusted assumptions, and prepared for possibilities that had not yet happened. The other kept old assumptions intact, believing the current order was stable enough to absorb any disturbance. This distance was not measured in territory or troop numbers, but in the willingness to change one's thinking when faced with the unprecedented. when history finally forced the two worlds to meet again nearly 2 decades later. That disparity would no longer be abstract. It would appear in reaction speed, in the ability to coordinate, and in how each side understood what was truly happening. The reconnaissance of 1223, therefore, was not a forgotten minor chapter, but the beginning of a long misalignment. A misalignment that only became visible when it was too late to correct through small adjustments. And this is often how history moves, not through constant thunder, but through early signs that are overlooked, lessons that are not remembered, and gaps in perception that quietly widen until they can no longer be concealed. In that quiet, history was already being prepared. When the Mongols returned in 1241, they did not step into an unfamiliar land. They stepped into a space they had already observed, measured, and remembered. Europe, meanwhile, faced an enemy it believed it was meeting for the first time. The reconnaissance of 1223, then, was not a loud prologue to a great war, but a small period at the end of a sentence Europe had not read carefully. And as history so often does, what is overlooked in silence can become the foundation for events that shake an entire continent. The year 1241 did not come to Europe like a thunderbolt. It came far more quietly, like a shift in pressure, something most people only feel when it is already too late. There was no single date on the calendar when the entire continent woke up with the same realization that the world was about to change. Instead, each land touched the upheaval at its own pace, through scattered fragments of news, belated warnings, and decisions made in a context where information was always one step behind reality. For the Mongols, 1241 was not a beginning, but a continuation. What unfolded in that year was built on nearly 2 decades of observation, experimentation, and remembrance. When their columns moved toward Central Europe, they did not enter an unfamiliar space. Routes had already been tested. The typical reactions of their opponents had already been anticipated. The points where European alliances might fracture had already been sketched in advance. The campaign, therefore, did not resemble a reckless adventure. It looked like a vast problem being solved step by step. On the other side, Europe received the first signals with hesitation, not because it lacked intelligence or experience, but because everything it knew about war made those signals appear like events that could still be controlled. News from the east arrived by indirect routes, bent and reshaped at every stop, every court, every storyteller. By the time a report finally reached a center of power, it had often been mixed with internal priorities, succession disputes, taxation, unresolved local conflicts. In that context, a distant danger was easily placed in the category of not yet urgent, a problem that could be postponed. This hesitation was not only political, it was conceptual. Europe was accustomed to sorting war by location and intensity. If danger arose on the frontier, it was treated as the frontier's problem. If a city was threatened, people trusted that its walls would hold long enough for allies to deliberate. In that logic, responsibility was divided into smaller parts, and with it came the feeling that no one needed to act immediately. Faith in walls and familiar terrain reinforced that slowness. Stonework and deep moats were not merely defensive structures. They were symbols of the ability to slow history itself. They represented the idea that every war must follow a human rhythm: arrive, stop, besiege, then either withdraw or compromise. In that mindset, time was an asset that could be purchased with labor, with patience, and with a willingness to endure short-term hardship in order to preserve long-term order. But the rhythm of the 1241 campaign did not obey that logic. And it was precisely this misalignment that produced the greatest shock. Instead of concentrating all force on a single clear objective, Mongol columns entered Central Europe along parallel directions, not to seize each point one by one, but to spread across the entire space a continuous sense of instability. Pressure did not come from one direction that could be met with a focused response. It came from many places at once, making every reaction scattered. In that environment, understanding what was truly happening became harder than confronting the threat itself. When reports arrived describing different avenues of advance, courts faced a question with no clear answer. Which thrust was the main one? Which was a feint? And whether there was any central point of the campaign that could be targeted at all. Every possible answer demanded a different decision, and every decision required time to achieve consensus. Fragmentation in perception quickly turned into fragmentation in action. Forces were moved to defend different places, often based on information already outdated the moment it was acted upon. Decisions were made with the aim of not losing too much. Yet they led to a situation in which nowhere was defended strongly enough. Without a reliable overall picture, each response solved only a small part of the problem, while the broader pressure continued to rise. The most dangerous element in such a situation was the feeling that there was still time to adjust, because there was no single moment marking total collapse. Many believed the old order was still holding on. Yet within that very span of time that seemed like holding on, the advantage gradually shifted toward the force that could maintain continuous pressure and alter tempo at will. In hindsight, Europe's initial hesitation was not the mistake of any single individual. It was the outcome of a world that had grown accustomed to a predictable kind of war. The year 1241 exposed the limits of that way of thinking. It showed that when war no longer waits for full understanding, the attempt to understand perfectly before acting can become a deadly disadvantage. And within the gap between that hesitation and the relentless tempo of advance, history began to bend toward a direction Europe could no longer fully control. In Poland, local forces faced pressure within a political context that was already complex. Alliances were formed in haste, shaped by feudal ties and expectations of honor rather than by a unified strategy. Armies assembled with no shortage of determination, but without a command mechanism cohesive enough to turn that determination into coordinated strength. When confronted with an opponent that moved quickly and constantly shifted tempo, the lack of synchronization was soon exposed. In Hungary, the situation was more decisive, not only because of what was happening on the battlefield, but because of the kingdom's position within the spatial structure of Central Europe itself. Hungary stood like an open door from the eastern steppe into the densely settled lands of the West, where natural routes, valleys, rivers, plains converged and led straight into the continent's interior. For centuries, that position had given Hungary the role of a buffer zone, a place that received and slowed movements from the east before they reached deeper kingdoms. Yet that buffer role carried a dangerous assumption that those movements would behave according to familiar rules. For the Mongols, Hungary was not only a target to pass through, it was an ideal space in which to test Europe's entire understanding of defense, logistics, and time. If those assumptions could be broken here, then the rest of Central Europe would become far more predictable. Hungarian forces entered 1241 with confidence in their ability to defend themselves. Strengthened by historical experience and by the kingdom's terrain, great rivers were viewed as natural defensive lines. Wide plains allowed large forces to assemble. Fortified walls and scattered strongholds created the sense that space could be controlled through fixed choke points. In that mindset, war was still a problem that could be solved by gathering sufficient strength in the right place at the right time. Hungary's mobilization reflected that belief. The focus was on assembling large numbers, relying on feudal relationships and traditional obligations. Knights and auxiliary forces concentrated with the expectation that a direct confrontation would decide the outcome. Victory, in the familiar imagination, would come from holding firm, maintaining formation, and proving strength in a symbolic moment. What was considered less was the question of tempo. Assembling large forces requires time, coordination, and a certain stability in the surrounding environment. Supply routes were imagined along familiar paths tied to granaries and fixed cities. This system functioned well when war moved slowly, when the enemy also had to stop, set camp, and wait. But it became fragile when faced with a force not bound by those stopping points. For the Mongols, Hungary was precisely the place to test that. Not to test whether they could win a battle, but to test whether they could force the opponent to react according to their rhythm. Directions of advance were chosen not only because terrain favored movement, but because they could place simultaneous pressure on multiple key points. While Hungarian forces struggled to determine which direction was primary and which secondary, the very process of analysis consumed precious time. Hungary's confidence, therefore, did not arise from naivety, but from reasonable historical experience in a world still governed by familiar rules. Yet 1241 placed that experience into a new context, where old rules could no longer explain unfolding events. What had once been advantages, central position, the ability to raise large forces, a fixed defensive network, began to reveal their downside when confronted with a campaign that did not seek to be pinned down. Hungary became a meeting point of two understandings of war. One side believed space could be locked down through concentrated strength. The other treated space as something that could be bent through speed and information. The coming confrontation, therefore, was not only between two armies, but between two assumptions about how the world behaves under extreme pressure. And within that crucial space, where the roads from the steppe opened into the heart of Central Europe, the year 1241 began to reveal its true nature, not as an ordinary invasion, but as a severe test of the entire defensive structure and war-thinking Europe had built over centuries. What made 1241 different lay not in the fact that battles occurred, but in how they occurred. The Mongols did not seek to force their opponents into a single decisive moment. Instead, they created a chain of situations that compelled continuous reaction. each reaction producing new imbalance. Formations were stretched. Communication broke. Decisions were made under conditions of incomplete information, guided by assumptions that were no longer valid. In that context, strongholds designed to slow war began to reveal their limits. High walls and deep moats still stood, but the campaign did not revolve around breaching each wall. Pressure was placed instead on transport routes, on the ability to assemble and sustain forces outside the walls, and on the psychology of communities accustomed to stable rhythms. When war no longer stopped at the city gate, the sense of safety tied to defensive architecture gradually lost its weight. Another element that spread the shock of 1241 was the speed with which consequences propagated. Not every place witnessed the same degree of fighting, but news of distant collapses quickly produced chain reactions. When confidence and control began to wobble, defensive decisions became either excessively cautious or, conversely, rushed and ill-considered. That psychological instability, though difficult to map, played a crucial role in shaping the year's course. For many European communities, 1241 was the first time they faced the feeling that war was no longer an event that could simply be waited out. Trade routes were disrupted outside familiar cycles. Movement became unpredictable. Plans based on fixed schedules rapidly lost meaning. War, rather than occurring in clearly bounded intervals, began to infiltrate daily life in ways that could not be anticipated. Meanwhile, the Mongols continued operating according to their systemic logic. An advance did not have to deliver symbolic triumph. As long as strategic objectives were secured, when conditions were unfavorable, tempo was adjusted. When weaknesses were exposed, pressure increased. The entire campaign resembled a moving body, sensing its environment and responding almost instantly to the smallest changes. The crucial point is that, from the Mongol perspective, the 1241 campaign did not need to end with permanent control of Central Europe in order to be considered successful, demonstrating that Europe's defensive assumptions could be broken, that alliances could fracture under properly applied pressure, and that the space of war could be shaped by a different tempo. That was enough to achieve broader strategic goals. In that moment, Europe was not merely defeated in a few battlefields. It was forced to confront the limits of the way it understood war. As 1241 passed, what remained was not only numbers or place names in chronicles. What remained was a deep unease that the familiar order had been placed under question, even in regions not directly under military pressure. Awareness spread that the world could change faster than human reaction could keep pace. New questions emerged. Would walls still be enough? Could local alliances endure pressure of a systemic kind? And was time truly still on the defender's side? The year 1241, therefore, was not only a date, it was a threshold of perception. It marked the moment Europe was forced to realize it was no longer on the margins of a larger story. What had been ignored in 1223 returned now not as warning, but as reality. And reality does not allow delay. In hindsight, the shock of 1241 did not come from brutality or scale alone, but from the gap in how two worlds prepared for what had not yet happened. One side was accustomed to living in motion, ready to adjust. The other was accustomed to stability, trusting its capacity to absorb shocks and recover. When those tempos collided, history leaned toward the faster rhythm. And that is why 1241 still echoes in Europe's historical memory, not as a year of total destruction, but as a year of belated awakening, a moment when an entire continent realized that assumptions that had protected it for centuries could become fragile in a very short time. When speaking of Mongol conquests, history is often pulled into extreme images, speed, overwhelming force, and the sense that everything collapsed too quickly to be fully understood. But if you look more closely, what made those campaigns effective did not lie only in mobility or military organization. It also lay in something far less visible: the way fear was produced, guided, and used as part of strategy. For the Mongols, fear was not an accidental byproduct of war. It was a variable that could be anticipated and, to a certain extent, managed. This did not come from meaningless cruelty, but from a highly practical understanding of human behavior under crisis. Over many generations of conflict on the steppe and beyond it, they observed that reactions to danger are not uniform, and it is precisely that unevenness that becomes leverage for strategy. They understood that there are communities which, under heavy pressure, will choose to resist to the end, not only because of military strength, but because honor, belief, or social structure compels them to do so. But they also knew there are other communities that will seek negotiation, not out of cowardice, but because they prioritize the long-term survival of people and property. And then there are places that fall into paralysis, where decisions are not made in time, because no one is sure they still control the situation. This diversity of reaction allows psychological warfare to function as an instrument of adjustment, not merely as a blow. The Mongols did not need to apply the same level of pressure everywhere. They could intensify tension in one region to observe how a neighboring region responded. They could temporarily ease pressure in one place to create a false sense of safety, and then exploit the complacency that grew from it. Fear, in this sense, did not explode everywhere at once. It spread along the crooked lines of psychology and information. Another key point is how fear was detached from any specific object. When war follows a familiar rhythm, people can anchor their fear to a clear image: an army at the city gate, an imminent battle, a definite day and hour. But in Mongol campaigns, the threat often did not remain in one place long enough to become a stable image. It moved, vanished, and reappeared elsewhere. Fear, therefore, had no concrete anchor to confront, and gradually became a prolonged psychological condition. That condition eroded collective decision-making. When people cannot clearly identify what they are afraid of, they also struggle to agree on how to respond. Debates drag on, decisions are delayed, and in that gap, advantage shifts toward the force that can sustain pressure without needing constant physical presence. Fear, once activated in the right way, becomes part of the campaign by itself. What is notable is that, from the Mongol perspective, managing fear did not mean maximizing panic. Pure panic can backfire, pushing the enemy into reckless action or uniting them against a common threat. Instead, the aim was to sustain a level of unease just strong enough to weaken coordination, but not strong enough to trigger a powerful, unified response. That balance is fragile, It requires continual observation and flexible adjustment. From the outside, such psychological warfare is easily mistaken for chaos or improvisation. In reality, it rests on a cold and consistent logic, where human beings are treated as part of the wartime environment, an environment whose patterns can be learned and predicted. In that context, fear ceases to be something beyond control and becomes a factor that can be calculated strategically, like terrain or weather. And here again, the difference between two worlds reveals itself. Medieval Europe did not yet have the language or conceptual framework to see fear as a strategic variable. Fear was seen as something to overcome through personal courage or faith, not as a collective phenomenon to be managed. When these two understandings collided, the advantage belonged to the side accustomed to observing and adjusting human reactions under pressure. Fear, therefore, was not only the darkness hanging over Mongol campaigns, it was also the faint light that helped them see more clearly how their opponents would behave. And in a war where understanding people matters no less than understanding terrain, that was an advantage very few forces of the era could match. Mongol psychological warfare did not operate through loud threats or theatrical declarations. On the contrary, it was often built from signals that were scattered, yet consistent. News of a distant force collapsing, of a city no longer reachable, of a route that suddenly became dangerous. These spread faster than armies themselves. Those stories, even when not always precise in detail, were highly precise in psychological impact. They pushed people to imagine the worst-case scenario before they ever faced reality. In Central Europe in 1241, Europe's slow information system unintentionally amplified this effect. When news arrived late, it often arrived compressed, carrying the sense that events were moving faster than anyone could track. Courts and local communities had to decide based on incomplete fragments. While psychological pressure steadily intensified, in this case, fear did not come from knowing too much. It came from knowing too little. The Mongols understood that very well. They did not need to be everywhere to create the feeling of being surrounded. They only had to appear at the right moment, at key points, and let the information vacuum do the rest. When a force withdrew quickly after applying pressure, its absence did not bring safety. It produced uncertainty. No one knew whether it was the end or merely a transition. And that uncertainty kept defensive psychology stretched over time. Another important aspect of psychological warfare was the way the Mongols differentiated the enemy's responses. Communities that surrendered early were often treated differently from those that resisted fiercely. This did not need to be publicly announced to become a message. A few examples, carried through the accounts of survivors, merchants, and messengers, were enough to create a psychological map in the imagination of neighboring lands. Each community began to ask itself, how will we be judged if we choose this path, or that one? That differentiation weakened the possibility of collective response. When each city and each lordship had to weigh its own choice, the idea of a unified resistance became fragile. Decisions were no longer based solely on military strategy, but also on fears about social and psychological consequences. Who would bear responsibility if resistance led to catastrophic loss? Who would be condemned if surrender was chosen? Those questions had no clear answers in the short term, and the hesitation they produced became a strategic advantage for the attackers. Psychological warfare also appeared in the way the Mongols regulated the tempo of pressure. They did not maintain maximum tension continuously, because that could allow the enemy to adapt. Instead, pressure rose and fell in unpredictable cycles. There were periods that seemed quiet, allowing people to believe the danger had receded. And then, as vigilance dropped, a new signal appeared, breaking the fragile stability that had just formed. This up and down rhythm ensured the defensive mind never truly rested. For European communities accustomed to a predictable rhythm of war, this condition was especially corrosive. Fear was no longer an immediate reaction to a specific assault. It became an underlying emotional climate, seeping into everyday life. People changed the way they traveled. Merchants hesitated when choosing routes. Political meetings became dominated by security questions rather than questions of growth. War, even when not continuously present as direct violence, left a deep imprint on social structure. What is striking is that, from the Mongol perspective, none of these consequences had to be tracked in detail everywhere. Once fear had been activated and began spreading through the enemy's own social networks, it ran on its own. Rumors, oral stories, and preventive decisions taken by each community reinforced one another, producing an effect far larger than direct military effort. War, in this sense, unfolded not only on battlefields, but inside human imagination and expectation. Compared to traditional feudal wars, where honor and direct confrontation stood at the center, this approach created a profound misalignment, not only on the battlefield, but in the very way leaders understood what victory meant. In the feudal world, war was often imagined as a chain of clearly recognizable moments, mustering forces, meeting the enemy, and determining the outcome through a confrontation large enough to carve itself into collective memory. Personal honor and elite legitimacy were tied to being present in that moment, to standing firm before the opponent, and to being seen as the one who stepped forward when history called. That is why many European leaders continued to seek a decisive battle, where they could face the enemy directly and prove strength through familiar patterns. They believed that if they held formation, preserved morale, and won in a clear moment, order would be restored. In that belief, war was still an event that could be framed, an episode with a relatively identifiable beginning and end. But while attention was fixed on preparing for that decisive moment, psychological warfare was quietly eroding the conditions that made such a moment meaningful at all. Fear did not concentrate at a single point where courage could defeat it. It spread, soaked into daily life, into social relationships, into the way people imagined the near future, when unease becomes the baseline state. A localized victory is no longer enough to convince a society that normal life has returned. This created a dangerous paradox. Even when a European force achieved success in a particular clash, the psychological impact was often limited in space and time. Good news traveled slowly, and by the time it arrived elsewhere, it was diluted by opposing stories. Meanwhile, the feeling of instability was sustained precisely by the lack of uniform information and by the continuation of pressure in other regions. Victory, in that context, could not spread fast enough or strongly enough to rebuild collective confidence. Moreover, a culture centered on personal honor made it difficult to acknowledge the effects of psychological pressure. Fear was treated as something to hide or overcome, not as something to analyze and address at a systemic level. When leaders focused on preserving face and projecting resilience, signs of psychological fatigue and social fracture were easily ignored. Those problems, left unresolved early, continued accumulating beneath the surface. This misalignment meant the two sides were not only fighting with different methods, they were pursuing different definitions of success for the Mongols. Weakening the enemy's coordination and confidence could already be a major victory, even without a symbolic climactic battle for feudal Europe. Success remained tied to a clear, tellable triumph, something increasingly difficult to produce under prolonged psychological pressure. As confidence and control declined, societies drifted into a prolonged defensive state in which every decision was shaped by short-term fear. Even small victories, rather than strengthening morale, were easily interpreted as temporary pauses before a threat that had not ended. A sense of security, once shattered at the level of perception, is very difficult to restore through a single event. And in that context, the limits of a war culture that placed too much expectation on the decisive moment became clear. When the enemy refused to play by the rules of that moment, when it stretched and fragmented conflict across multiple psychological layers, then waiting for a battle big enough to resolve everything could become a strategy that weakened itself. Psychological warfare, therefore, challenged not only military strength, but the very way people understood the meaning of victory and the end of war. Mongol psychological warfare, therefore, was not a secondary add-on to the campaign. It was the invisible groundwork covering the entire process. It did not aim to spread blind panic. It aimed to create an environment in which the enemy was always forced to make decisions at a disadvantage. In such an environment, small mistakes could be magnified, and choices that were reasonable under normal conditions could lead to outcomes beyond expectation. Looking back at 1241 through this lens, it becomes clear that many European failures did not arise from a lack of courage or resources, but from being forced to face a kind of pressure they had never learned to manage. Fear, when not recognized and governed, becomes a spontaneous force, scattering attention, breaking coordination, and slowing adaptation. And that is the key point. The Mongols did not create fear out of nothing. They exploited gaps that already existed in the enemy's information structure, in decision-making processes, and in assumptions about time. Psychological warfare, in this case, functioned as a mirror reflecting those limits. It showed that in a world where information moved slowly and responsibility was fragmented, fear could become a weapon as effective as any cavalry force. The question of why the Mongols withdrew from Europe is often posed as if we are searching for a single cause, clear, neat, and definitive, a death, an order, a political turning point. But history rarely works in such a simple way. The Mongol withdrawal was not an immediate reflex to one isolated event. It was the outcome of multiple layers of decision laid over one another, weighed within a mindset in which war never exists apart from governance, logistics, and long-term strategic priorities. First, it is necessary to understand that for the Mongols, the European campaign never carried the same meaning as a fully settled, comprehensive conquest. The goal was not to occupy and permanently restructure every region according to a fixed model of administration. Rather, it was to expand the sphere of influence, to test how different political military systems would respond, and to ensure that no significant threat could form from the West in the near future. When placed within that framework of objectives, the question, why not continue, begins to look very different from the familiar European perspective. To expand that idea, you have to step out of the European habit of imagining conquest as a single, linear story: march in, capture capitals, plant banners, build a new administrative order, and hold the land until it becomes yours in a settled sense. That model made intuitive sense in a landscape of castles, walled towns, and territorial lordship, where authority was often expressed through fixed points on the map. But the Mongol Empire was not born from fixed points. It was born from movement, from the logic of distance and speed, and from an administrative flexibility that did not require the same kind of permanent occupation to produce real power. For the Mongols, control existed on a spectrum. At one end was direct annexation and garrisoned rule. But far more often, especially in distant or costly theaters, control meant something else: a region that had been forced to acknowledge Mongol reach, a political system that had been made to calculate Mongol retaliation, a ruling class that had been shown what happens when coordination fails and time runs out. In that sense, conquest was not always about building a new state on top of the old one. It could be about bending the behavior of other states, turning them into cautious neighbors, tributary partners, neutral buffers, or fractured actors too afraid and too divided to become dangerous. This is why the European campaign can be read less as an unfinished occupation and more as a strategic demonstration with measurable outputs. It was a massive reconnaissance in force, but one that did not merely scout terrain. It tested human systems. It put different kinds of political organization under stress: feudal levy structures, coalition decision-making, the speed of royal summons, the reliability of vassal obligations, the limits of castle-based defense, and watched where they broke. That information was not abstract. It was practical intelligence: how quickly armies assemble, how fast news travels, how long a region can sustain pressure before it fractures, how likely elites are to cooperate when risk rises, how predictable an enemy becomes when they insist on a decisive battle. Seen this way, cities and fortresses were not automatically the end goal. They were instruments in a larger experiment. A fortified town might be taken not because it was the future seat of Mongol administration, but because its fall, or its survival, would reveal something about regional morale, supply capacity, or the psychology of neighboring rulers. One region might be hit hard to create a shockwave. Another might be bypassed to see how fear and uncertainty spread when the threat is mobile and hard to locate. The European theater, with its dense patchwork of lordships and slow diplomatic machinery, offered an ideal laboratory for this kind of strategic observation. It also helps to remember that the Mongol Empire did not expand west in isolation. It expanded on multiple fronts, across staggering distances. through an imperial system that had to constantly decide where attention, princes, and resources mattered most. That reality shapes the meaning of continuing. Continuing was never simply keep riding forward. Continuing would mean converting a high-mobility expedition into a long-duration project of occupation in a region with different geography, different agrarian rhythms, different fortification density, and different political fragmentation than the steppe and the zones they already knew how to manage efficiently. That conversion is possible, but it has a cost, and the Mongols, more than most medieval powers, were unusually willing to treat cost as strategic, not emotional. In Europe, the map invited a seductive illusion. If you can win a battle, you can take the land. If you can take the land, you can hold it. But to hold, in the Mongol sense, did not always require sitting on every castle. It could mean ensuring that no unified force would emerge. It could mean leaving behind an after-image of speed and punishment strong enough to reshape policy for a generation. It could mean turning the idea of distance into a lie, so that Western rulers would forever have to ask themselves whether time was truly on their side, if that psychological and structural effect had already been achieved. Then pushing further might not add proportionate value. It might add territory. Yes, but territory is only valuable when it can be integrated without distorting the entire system that won it. So when Europeans ask, why didn't they continue? They often assume the only rational endpoint is permanent occupation and settlement. But from a Mongol strategic lens, the endpoint could be something quieter, a continent that had been forced to recognize Mongol reach, a network of rulers who now planned under the shadow of possible return, and a western frontier that, whether or not it was ruled directly, had been strategically softened in that framework. Withdrawal does not automatically signal failure. It can signal completion, the close of a phase in which the campaign's true product was not a new province, but a new balance of fear, information, and long-term deterrence. One factor often mentioned is the upheaval at the center of Mongol power, where a change in leadership required the presence of key figures in an empire built upon personal relationships, consensus, and political ritual. The need for senior commanders to return and participate in the reconfiguration of authority could not be treated lightly. But to treat this as the sole cause is to miss the wider context. Returning only makes sense when the external campaign has already achieved enough to allow a pause. And at that moment, from the Mongol point of view, many crucial objectives had been completed, precisely in the way a campaign of probing, pressure, and adjustment needed to complete them. Europe's defensive assumptions had not merely been challenged in theory, they had been tested under real conditions and had revealed their limits. Walls that were believed capable of buying time proved that they could slow only familiar scenarios, yet they could not slow a rhythm of war that did not intend to stop. Alliances built on feudal obligation and personal honor showed how fragile they became when forced to respond to multi-directional, continuous pressure. Strategic routes into Central Europe, routes that previously existed only as possibilities on a map, had now been surveyed through real movement, real tempo, and the real reactions of people living along them. The Mongols learned where rapid advance was possible, where adjustments would be required, and where choke points might emerge under different scenarios. This knowledge was not merely immediate. It carried long-term value because it transformed an unfamiliar space into a space that had been read and understood, more importantly than anything else. The campaign triggered a deep shift in Europe's perception of security. Fear and instability appeared not only in regions under direct pressure, but spread into places that had never even seen the enemy. The belief that distance and time could protect people began to shake. When an entire continent is forced to ask whether it still has enough time to respond, a major strategic objective has been achieved without needing to occupy every piece of land. In that context, logistics becomes a factor that must be considered not as a weakness, but as a natural limit on any campaign. The Mongols could move far and fast not because they did not need logistics, but because their logistics were designed not to bind them to fixed points. Herds of horses, a mobile way of life, and the ability to draw sustenance from the environment allowed them to maintain pressure across great distances without long, vulnerable supply lines. Yet that very logistical awareness also meant they clearly understood that every region has its own threshold of endurance. Central Europe, with higher population density, a different agricultural structure, and seasonal rhythms not fully synchronized with the long-range movement of a large cavalry force, posed challenges that could not be solved merely by moving faster. Maintaining healthy horses over an extended period, ensuring suitable forage, and avoiding the depletion of the surrounding environment were problems that could not be ignored. To prolong the campaign beyond a certain threshold would have required the Mongols to make deep adjustments to their operating system, changing their pace of movement, redistributing forces, and accepting new risks related to dispersion and control. Those changes were entirely possible, but they did not have to be made immediately when the strategic objectives at hand had already been met. In their logic, continuing forward was not the default. Continuing only made sense when additional gains clearly outweighed the rising costs and risks. Here, the difference in how war itself was understood becomes visible again. Europe was accustomed to reading withdrawal as a sign of exhaustion or hidden failure. The Mongols, by contrast, saw the ability to stop at the right moment as part of strength. Withdrawing from Europe did not erase what had been achieved. It froze those achievements at their most advantageous point, when the opponent was still adjusting its perception, while the Mongols retained the freedom to choose when and where to move next. Therefore, when the withdrawal is placed within the full campaign picture, it is not a retreat from the goal. It is the completion of a phase, one in which Europe had been forced to look back at itself, while the Mongols carried away a storehouse of data, experience, and psychological impact large enough to shape strategic calculations for years to come. Another important factor is how the Mongols assessed long-term risk. Advancing deeper into Europe meant stretching forces across an immense space, while the territories behind still required control and stabilization. For an empire expanding rapidly on multiple fronts, the allocation of resources was always an exercise in balance. Withdrawal, in this sense, was not abandonment. It was a reallocation of priority to preserve the sustainability of the entire system. From the European side, that withdrawal was often interpreted as an unexpected deliverance, or as evidence that the threat had passed. But that interpretation reveals more about the psychological needs of those witnessing it than about the intent of those withdrawing. The Mongols did not leave behind a declaration of closure or a treaty designed to reassure. They left a strategic vacuum in which the question, will they return, hovered, unanswered, unresolved. And that ambiguity was part of the long-term effect, because it did not allow memory to close in the familiar way. There was no clear treaty to mark an ending, no symbolic victory to soothe anxiety. Instead, Europe entered the period after 1241 with a lingering insecurity, suspended between two states, knowing that something fundamental had changed, yet not knowing whether the threat had truly gone, or was merely temporarily beyond sight. In the early years after the shock, the reaction was an intensification of defense. Fortresses were strengthened, not only with stone and moats, but with adjustments to spatial organization and control of entry and exit. Defensive plans were reconsidered with a seriousness rarely seen before. Questions once treated as theoretical, about the speed of mustering forces, about coordination between regions, about protecting lines of movement, now became practical matters of discussion. Fear, in this phase, acted as a powerful catalyst, forcing societies to look directly at weaknesses that had been exposed. But the enemy's absence also began to erode that momentum, without direct pressure. Maintaining a high state of vigilance became costly, politically, economically, and psychologically. Reforms demanded long-term coordination among lordships accustomed to acting independently. Spending on defense competed with other urgent needs, rebuilding, restoring social stability, and addressing internal conflicts that had been compressed during the crisis. Gradually, urgency gave way to fatigue. Warnings began to sound like echoes of a danger already gone. Security councils met less often. Long-term plans were postponed in favor of problems visible in the immediate present. Not because people completely forgot the lesson of 1241, but because no one can live forever in a state of waiting for a threat with no clear shape. In that environment, familiar internal priorities returned to dominate attention. Power struggles between courts and lords resurfaced. Questions of taxation, succession, and territory again became the center of political life. War, once more, was understood through the familiar frame of local conflict and near interests, rather than as a systemic pressure that could emerge from outside at any moment. The return of old priorities did not mean everything went back to what it had been before. A crack had formed in the collective perception, even when covered over by daily routine. That crack remained, so that every rumor from the east, every whisper of distant movement, was received with more caution than before. Europe lived in a dilemma, wanting to believe order had been restored, yet unable to fully discard the memory of fragility that had once become unmistakably visible. And it is precisely this dilemma that formed the deepest psychological legacy of the post-1241 period. It did not produce a comprehensive reform immediately, but it planted seeds for slower, scattered changes, small improvements in military organization, in information gathering. In ways of thinking about speed and coordination began to appear in certain places, even if they were not enough to transform the entire structure. Looking back, we can see that the ambiguity of the withdrawal placed Europe into a long-term test. Whether a society can sustain the lessons drawn from crisis when the threat is no longer visibly present, the answer is never entirely clear. But the struggle itself became inseparable from European history after the 13th century. History shaped not only by what happened, but by what might have happened, and by the fear that it could return at any time. From a strategic point of view, withdrawal also allowed the Mongols to retain initiative over time, rather than being drawn into a prolonged conflict with increasing costs. They chose the moment to stop while advantage still leaned their way. That aligns with a philosophy of war that does not seek total control at all times, but seeks the power to decide when to continue and when to stop. Another perspective, less often mentioned, concerns the impact of the European campaign on the Mongols themselves. Every major advance consumes resources, but it also yields experience and information. Returning allowed them to integrate those lessons into the broader structure of the empire, adjust operations on other fronts, and prepare for future campaigns in a system of continuous learning. Pausing in order to synchronize is a rational step, not a sign of weakness. What makes the question, "Why withdraw?" so compelling is that it touches a human desire for a story with a clear ending, but in reality, for the Mongols, war was not a linear narrative with a fixed climax and resolution. It was a sequence of states, where each phase was evaluated by the degree to which objectives were met and by the cost required in that framework. Withdrawal from Europe is not a hidden failure. It is a decision consistent with the logic that guided the entire campaign. And perhaps the most important point to remember is this: the withdrawal did not erase what had happened. Europe's assumptions had been challenged. Weaknesses had been exposed. And the memory of a threat that was distant, fast, and hard to predict had been etched into the collective mind. Even if the Mongols did not return in the way many had feared, their imprint continued to shape how Europe thought about war, defense, and the fragility of familiar order. Europe, after the Mongols, did not wake up to a clear morning, nor did it step into a new era through a solemn proclamation. That awakening unfolded slowly, unevenly, and sometimes in contradiction. It was not a single moment of understanding everything at once, but a prolonged process in which old assumptions were gradually worn down by the memory of a shock no one wished to repeat. Immediately after 1241, the most visible change was a shift in how space was felt and imagined. Before then, Europe often pictured the world in familiar, concentric circles. The lordship where power was directly exercised, the borderlands where danger began to blur, and then distant regions placed outside the range of practical concern. That order offered a sense of control, that the world could be categorized, that danger could be kept at a safe distance, and that time would always stand on the side of those living deep within the continent's inner ring. The Mongol advance collapsed that layered perception not through theory, but through experience. Distance was no longer a reliable barrier, because it had been crossed faster than human reaction could keep pace. Regions once considered out of reach suddenly became the source of a very real threat, not in some distant future, but in the near present. This forced Europe to face an uncomfortable truth. Security could no longer be defined simply by geographic position. What changed first was not policy, but imagination. For centuries, European societies had organized their sense of danger around proximity. Threats were expected to grow louder as they drew closer, to announce themselves through border skirmishes, diplomatic warnings, or gradual military buildup. Time was assumed to be available, time to summon vassals, negotiate alliances, reinforce walls, and prepare for siege. The Mongol advance shattered this rhythm. The warning arrived almost simultaneously with the impact. News and destruction moved at nearly the same speed in that compression of time. Europe discovered that its traditional buffers, distance, intermediaries, and delay were far thinner than it had believed. As a result, the mental map Europeans carried began to distort. The world no longer felt like a set of concentric rings, growing safer toward the center. Instead, it began to resemble a connected field, where movement in one distant zone could suddenly ripple inward with little notice. A region's safety could no longer be inferred from how far it lay from the frontier. It depended increasingly on how well information traveled, how quickly decisions were made, and how coordinated responses could be across political boundaries. This was a quiet but radical shift. Security was becoming temporal and informational, not merely spatial. There was no single moment when rulers gathered to declare this insight. No doctrine was written to formalize it. The change crept in through anxiety, rumor, and reluctant adaptation. Chronicles began to emphasize speed and surprise. Diplomatic correspondents grew more attentive to reports from merchants, travelers, and envoys. The idea that nothing happens beyond our horizon that concerns us became harder to sustain, even when the Mongols withdrew. The lesson remained embedded. The horizon itself was no longer a guarantee of safety. Walls and fortresses did not lose their value, but their meaning changed. They had once represented the primary solution, solid answers to insecurity. After the Mongol shock, they began to look more like final measures rather than first lines of defense. A wall could stop an enemy at a gate, but it could not slow an enemy who had already outpaced the political and informational systems meant to respond to them. By the time an army appeared before the walls, the deeper failure had already occurred elsewhere, in delayed communication, fractured authority, or misjudged timing. Gradually, attention shifted toward earlier stages of the threat cycle. How quickly could warnings travel? Who was responsible for interpreting them? How fast could forces be assembled across multiple jurisdictions? These questions were not new, but they gained new urgency. Time itself emerged as a strategic resource, something that could be lost or preserved, squandered or leveraged. And once time was understood in this way, geography alone could no longer carry the burden of security. This transformation did not make Europe suddenly efficient or unified. Systems of information remained slow, uneven, and often unreliable. Political fragmentation still imposed severe limits on coordination. But indifference was no longer the default posture. Distant movement, once easy to dismiss, now carried an undercurrent of concern, even when rulers chose not to act. That choice increasingly came with the awareness that delay itself was a risk. In this sense, the Mongol advance redrew Europe's mental map without ever touching a pen. It replaced the comforting illusion of layered distance with a more unsettling reality, that security depended less on where one stood and more on how quickly one could see, decide, and move in a world where speed had become a weapon. This shift showed itself clearly in how cities and kingdoms thought about defense. Walls continued to be built and reinforced because they were still necessary and still carried immense symbolic value. But for the first time, they were no longer treated as the final answer. People began to recognize that a wall is useful only when it is the last link in a chain of warning, not the first point of response. When an enemy appears at the gate, then, strategically speaking, it is already too late. The question therefore began to move, slowly but irreversibly, from how do we hold out behind the wall to how do we know what is coming before it reaches the wall. This was a change in perception more than in technique. It reflected Europe beginning to care about time as an independent strategic factor, rather than merely as a consequence of siege and waiting. In that environment, attention to gathering news, still crude and unsystematic, grew markedly. People who had once been seen as peripheral to political life, messengers, merchants, pilgrims, were gradually viewed through a different lens. They were not merely travelers driven by personal need or religious duty. They carried traces of the outside world, the stories they told, the roads they chose, the places they avoided. Each contained information. Gradually, a new awareness formed. The world was not understood only through maps and chronicles, but through the flow of people. Every trade route became a potential information channel. Every pilgrimage carried not only faith, but news from the lands it passed through. Those fragments, however scattered, began to be assembled in the collective imagination, creating a more dynamic picture of the security environment. This shift did not turn Europe into a modern continent overnight. Information systems remained slow, fragmented, and easy to distort. But what changed was attitude. Indifference toward distant movement was no longer the natural reflex. A new vigilance, still without a clear shape, had appeared. And that vigilance marked the first step of a Europe learning to live in a world where distance no longer meant safety. At the military level, there was no immediate, continent-wide reform. Europe remained fragmented, with each region learning its lesson in its own way. But small adjustments began to appear. Coordination between forces became a more frequent topic of discussion. The speed of mobilization and the capacity to respond quickly began to matter more. Even while still constrained by feudal structures, lessons about the danger of stretching formations too thin, about the fragility of communication, were remembered not in theoretical treatises, but in more cautious decisions in later conflicts. More importantly, Europe began to see war as a systemic phenomenon, not merely a chain of local confrontations. Before the Mongols, many conflicts were understood as disputes between powerful individuals or dynasties. After that collision, a growing recognition emerged. War could exceed the control of any single lord or any single battle. It could spread, reshape the rhythm of life, and affect communities that never directly held a weapon. That awakening seeped into political thinking in a quiet yet persistent way. Courts, still absorbed in familiar struggles, began to realize that focusing only on nearby rivals was not enough to guarantee long-term safety. The threat from the East had revealed a hard truth. Internal conflicts, however important, become secondary when faced with systemic pressure beyond the borders of any one kingdom. The mentality of each region fends for itself began to show its limits in a world where danger could pass through multiple lordships in a very short time. In that context, alliances began to be weighed with a broader horizon, even if they remained fragile and full of suspicion. Cooperation was no longer seen only as a temporary tool against a specific enemy, but as a capacity that needed to be maintained for situations not yet predictable. The idea of shared interest across many lands in the face of external threat began to surface, not as a unified doctrine, but as a question hovering in political discussion. What happens if every kingdom continues to act as though it can stand alone? 1241 did not immediately create a united Europe, nor was it powerful enough to break the deep barriers of feudal structure. But it planted the seed of a new skepticism toward fragmentation. The question of the price of division began to appear, even without clear answers. Often that seed was overshadowed by short-term priorities, but it did not disappear. It waited for other future shocks to raise the question again, with increasing urgency. At the social level, memory of the Mongols gradually became part of the collective mind, preserved not only in official chronicles, but in stories passed from one generation to the next. These stories were often more cautionary than detailed. They did not focus on reconstructing each battle, but on the overwhelming feeling caused by speed and unpredictability. In doing so, they carried a deeper message. The outside world does not remain still while people prepare, as it was transmitted. This memory inevitably blended with myth and fear. Details were exaggerated, gaps filled with imagination, yet even in that distorted form, memory retained an important function. It became a background layer of vigilance, reminding communities that assumptions of stability can be broken at any time. What had once seemed impossible, once it had happened, could no longer be dismissed simply because it did not fit familiar experience. For many, memory of the Mongols was no longer a specific fear, but a vague sense of how fragile order could be. It surfaced whenever rumors of distant movement appeared, whenever a route became unstable, whenever a new threat was mentioned that no one yet fully understood. In those moments, history was not recalled as a sequence of events, but as a whisper. The world can change faster than people want to believe. It was precisely the combination of shifting political thought and settling social memory that formed the foundation of Europe's long-term awakening. It did not produce instant reforms or early unified structures, but it changed how people asked questions about security, cooperation, and shared responsibility. And in history, it is sometimes those unanswered questions that become the most durable engine of change. Yet this awakening did not always lead to progress in a straight line. Europe continued to fall into familiar cycles of internal conflict, where larger lessons were obscured by immediate interests. There were periods in which memory of the Mongols faded, overshadowed by other wars and other anxieties. But even in those periods, one thing had changed permanently. The capacity to imagine a threat coming from afar existed and could never be fully erased. The shift in how time was understood was another deep consequence. Before, many defensive plans rested on the assumption that there would always be enough time to respond, to summon forces, to negotiate after the Mongols. That assumption became fragile. Time was no longer treated as a default asset. it became a factor to be managed, like manpower or food. This slow change influenced how Europe approached war and governance in the centuries that followed. Looking back, we can see that Europe's awakening after the Mongols did not lie in copying the enemy's model, but in recognizing its own limits. Europe did not become Mongol and did not need to. But that collision forced the continent to face the reality that the world was larger, faster, and more complex than traditional feudal structures had assumed. This awakening also carried a moral and philosophical dimension. It raised questions about the fragility of human-built order and about the relationship between stability and adaptation. Europe began to understand that no structure, however solid, can endure if it is unwilling to adjust to external change. This was not a lesson only for war, but for the entire way societies organize and protect themselves. So when we say Europe awoke after the Mongols, we should not imagine a bright, decisive awakening. It was a more alert state, more cautious, and sometimes more anxious. A state in which the memory of 1241 was no longer a direct fear, but a quiet reminder that the world can change faster than human prediction. In that state, Europe continued walking through the centuries that followed, carrying both the lessons it had learned and the lessons it had not yet managed to learn. The Mongols did not stay to shape Europe according to their will, but their brief appearance was enough to change how the continent looked at itself. And that, perhaps, is the deepest imprint of an encounter that seemed short within the long river of human history. When we look back on the Mongol conquests, history often stands before a familiar temptation to turn them into myth. The myth of extraordinary speed, the myth of unstoppable power, the myth of a storm rising from the steppe, transcending every rule human beings thought they understood. Yet that very way of seeing them obscures what matters most. Because if the Mongols are only myth, then their history offers no lesson beyond astonishment. But if they are a mirror, then their story forces us to look back at ourselves. The final truth is that the Mongols did not win because they were different in some supernatural sense. They won because they organized their world according to a logic that fit the reality they lived in. From the vast steppe, where distance is not measured by borders, but by the rhythm of movement, they formed a way of thinking that treated space as something that could be bent, and time as a resource to be managed. In that world, traveling far did not mean losing control, and dispersing forces did not mean chaos. On the contrary, that was the normal condition of existence. Life on the steppe demanded this logic long before it was ever applied to war. Survival depended on constant motion, following pasture, water, and seasonal cycles across enormous expanses of land. Families, herds, and communities were accustomed to operating while spread out, yet still connected through shared signals, routines, and expectations. Coordination was not achieved by centralization and immobility, but by rhythm, by knowing when others would move, where they would converge, and how information would flow between them, what might look, from a sedentary perspective, like disorder was in fact a finely tuned system, adapted to a fluid environment. When this mindset entered warfare, it did not create something artificial or exceptional. It simply extended everyday practices into a military form. Mongol commanders did not need to invent entirely new habits under pressure. They relied on patterns already embedded in their way of life. Movement, separation, and recombination of forces were not emergency measures, but routine operations. An army spread across wide terrain was not out of control as long as its internal logic remained intact. Orders did not have to be constantly reissued because expectations were shared in advance. Units knew not only where to go, but how to behave when cut off, delayed, or forced to improvise. This is where the management of time became decisive. Mongol operations were designed to compress the enemy's decision-making window. By appearing sooner than expected, from directions not anticipated, they forced opponents into reactive modes. The goal was not merely to win battles, but to control tempo, to act while the other side was still orienting itself. Time ceased to be a neutral backdrop and became an active dimension of power. Those who moved faster did not simply arrive earlier. They shaped the sequence of events to their advantage. Equally important was the Mongol understanding of space as relational rather than fixed. Space was not defined primarily by ownership or fortification, but by accessibility. What mattered was not who controlled a place in theory, but who could reach it, supply it, and move through it in practice. This perspective allowed the Mongols to treat vast regions as interconnected corridors rather than isolated territories. Rivers, plains, and passes were valued not as borders, but as pathways. The map they used was not static. It was animated by movement. From the outside, this produced the illusion of an unstoppable force. Armies seemed to appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish. But this was not magic. It was consistency. The same logic governed logistics, communication, reconnaissance, and combat. There was no contradiction between strategy and daily life. War did not require the Mongols to adopt an alien mode of thinking. It asked them to apply their existing one with greater intensity and coordination. This coherence stands in sharp contrast to societies whose military systems required them to suspend normal life and adopt special, temporary structures in times of war. In such systems, friction was inevitable. Mobilization took time. Coordination depended on fragile chains of command. When pressure mounted, the gap between how people lived and how they were expected to fight widened. The Mongols, by contrast, fought the way they lived and lived the way they moved. Seen in this light, Mongol success was not a mystery or an anomaly. It was the outcome of alignment. Their environment shaped their habits shaped their institutions, and their institutions shaped their military power. Where other societies struggled to adapt to sudden change, the Mongols had already internalized flexibility as a baseline condition. What they demonstrated, above all, was that power emerges not from exotic advantages, but from the fit between a society's logic and the world it inhabits. When that mindset was brought into war, it did not produce miracles. It produced a rare consistency between how one thinks and how one acts. Decisions on the battlefield did not contradict the rhythm of daily life, because they were born from the same foundation of perception. War, in this case, was not an exception to life. It was an extension of what people were already used to doing, moving, adapting, observing, and adjusting continuously. That seamlessness is precisely what made the system run so smoothly that, from the outside, it looked like a power that could not be stopped. This becomes even clearer when the Mongols are placed beside 13th century Europe. Europe did not lack courage, nor did it lack resources or battlefield experience. But its mental structure had been built for a slower, more fragmented world, one in which space was understood as fixed land to be held, and time was treated as something that could be stretched through waiting and defense. War, in that logic, was a predictable sequence of events: muster, clash, siege, and finally the settling of victory and defeat. Walls, moats, and the rituals of siege were not merely military tools. They were material expressions of a way of understanding the world. They reflected the belief that conflict could be anchored at a specific point, that if that point could be held long enough, order would automatically be restored in a world that moves slowly and familiarly. That belief once had a basis, but when a force appeared with a different tempo, one that did not seek to halt before those familiar anchor points, the entire structure of thought began to shake. The gap, therefore, did not lie in numbers or weapons, but in how each side understood the world as it operated. One side saw space as something to be protected by fixed boundaries. The other saw space as a field of movement. One side believed time could be purchased by waiting. The other treated time as something to be seized through action. When those two understandings collided, the result was not merely victory or defeat in a battle, but the exposure of the deep assumptions each society relied upon. It is at this point that the Mongols become an uncomfortable mirror. They did not show that Europe was weak. They showed that Europe was operating according to a logic no longer suited to the new tempo of the world. What made the collision so painful was not the enemy's absolute superiority, but the feeling that what had once seemed reasonable, stable, and sufficient had suddenly become outdated in a new context. And that lesson goes beyond military history. When a society organizes its world around assumptions no longer compatible with a changing reality, collapse, if it comes, often arrives not because of a lack of effort, but because effort is being poured into places that no longer work. The Mongols, in that light, are not a strange anomaly of history, but a clear demonstration of the power of consistency between thought and action, a demonstration any society, in any age, can hold up to itself. In that sense, the Mongols are not a story of absolute brutality, but a story of systemic effectiveness. They linked information, reconnaissance, logistics, and tactics into a flexible whole. They did not seek a single moment of glory. They sought the gradual collapse of the enemy's capacity to respond. Fear, in their hands, was not an improvised instrument, but a variable to be observed, activated, and adjusted, seen from that angle. What stunned Europe was not raw military force, but the sense that its deepest assumptions had been inverted. Distance no longer protected. Time no longer stood with the defender. Alliances built on honor and personal obligation were no longer fast enough to meet systemic pressure. When the things once treated as foundations became fragile, history forced people to ask uncomfortable questions about the very structure they relied on. The Mongols' withdrawal from Europe made the nature of this mirror even clearer. Had they stayed, occupied, and restructured the continent according to their own model, history might have told the story in a more familiar way. A conquest, a new empire, a replacement order, but their withdrawal, leaving behind an ambiguous void, forced Europe to face what had been revealed. There was no enemy presence to blame. Only questions remained about readiness, about adaptability, and about the cost of changing too slowly. The Mongol mirror, therefore, does not reflect a comfortable image. It reflects a world in which structures that seem solid can become obsolete very quickly when the context shifts. It shows that strength lies not only in how many resources one possesses, but in how those resources are connected and used. And it reminds us that history does not favor those who assume the current order is the default. This does not mean Europe should have become Mongol. Every society is shaped by its own conditions, values, and aims. But the collision with the Mongols posed a timeless question. What does a society do when reality moves faster than the assumptions it rests upon? That question does not belong only to the 13th century. It echoes through every period in which technology, environment, or power structures change the tempo of the world. In the centuries that followed, Europe learned some lessons and missed many others. There were improvements in information, in military organization, in how time and distance were perceived. But there were also moments when memory of the Mongols was blurred, pushed aside by internal conflicts and a newly formed confidence. The mirror is not always faced directly. Sometimes it is turned toward the wall until another shock forces people to look again. The final truth, then, lies not in what the Mongols did to Europe, but in what they showed Europe about itself. In that mirror, Europe saw the limits of a security built too long on stone and waiting. Walls, no matter how high and thick, can protect space, but they cannot protect time. And in a world where the tempo of change outruns the tempo of response, time is the easiest thing to lose. The Mongols showed that security cannot be built only of material things, but of the capacity to recognize and adapt. When distant movements are no longer peripheral, failing to see early becomes a weakness. Europe was forced to face the truth that safety does not come from standing still with solidity, but from understanding that one stands inside a continuous current of information, people, and decisions. That is not a pleasant recognition, because it demands the surrender of a familiar feeling of stability. They also showed that time cannot always be bought through waiting for centuries, stretching a conflict, waiting for the enemy to tire, or relying on seasonal rhythms to slow war had been rational strategies. But when the opponent is not bound by those rhythms, waiting is no longer strategy. It becomes dangerous delay. Time, in those circumstances, does not stand with anyone. It simply passes, carrying away missed opportunities. More than that, the Mongols exposed something many societies hesitate to admit. Collective strength does not arise naturally from names or declarations. It is not created simply by naming an alliance or raising a common symbol. That strength forms only where real coordination exists, where information is shared in time, where responsibility is clearly distributed, and where decisions can be executed at a speed suited to the situation. Without those conditions, the name becomes an empty shell, and the collective exists only on paper. If we treat the Mongols as myth, their history ends with amazement and the safe distance of the observer. They become a story to retell, an event to admire or fear, then gradually placed in a compartment of the far past. But if we treat them as a mirror, that comfort is not allowed. Their history continues to live because it forces each generation to ask where it stands in the relationship between stability and change. That mirror raises questions with no permanent answers. Questions about how we organize information. Do we see the world as it is moving, or only as we want it to remain still? Questions about how we respond to fear. Do we let fear paralyze our capacity to act? Or do we use it as a signal to adjust and prepare? And questions about preparedness. Are we building systems for the world as it once was, built on familiar, safe assumptions, or for the world as it is becoming, faster, more complex, and less forgiving of delay? These questions do not belong only to the Mongols, and they are not meant solely for 13th century Europe. They echo through every era in which human beings face change that exceeds their ability to predict. And for that reason, this story does not close with a certain conclusion, but with a state of wakefulness, a reminder that history, when seen correctly, does not only recount what happened, it illuminates the choices we are making now and will be forced to make in that light. The Mongols do not stand as a ghost of the past, nor as a model to be copied. They stand as an honest mirror, reflecting the relationship between thought and reality. And the final question that mirror asks is not, how are we different from them? But, by what logic are we organizing our world? And is that logic still compatible with the world opening in front of us? As we close this journey, perhaps the most important thing is not to remember every battle or every date, but to keep the alertness the story leaves behind. A sense that history is not a chain of dead events, but humanity's storehouse of experience in moments of change. And in that storehouse, the Mongols do not stand as a ghost of the past, but as a mirror placed before the present, quiet and yet uncompromising. Because history, in the end, does not ask whether we admire or fear what happened. It asks something far simpler. Have we learned anything when the world changes faster than what we once believed was enough? The Mongol War in Europe was not a story of meaningless brutality, nor a myth of invincible conquerors. It was a story about organization, about information, and about the limits that even the greatest power cannot surpass indefinitely. Europe did not defeat the Mongols, but Europe did learn something from that brief collision, that the world was wider, more complex, and more tightly interconnected than it had ever imagined. Before you drift deeper into sleep, take just a very small moment to connect with others who are listening to this story alongside you. If you'd like, leave us a comment and tell us where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. It might be a quiet room somewhere in Europe, a city in Asia slowly turning off its lights, or a place far away on the map where history continues to move silently, breath by breath. And if you feel that slow historical stories, told to understand rather than to shock, are something you'd like to hear more of during long nights, you can choose to follow the channel, not to chase algorithms, but so that we can meet again through other stories, from other times. when the world was very different from today. Now, let the story settle. History does not exist to glorify war, but to remind us that every order is fragile. Wishing you a quiet night.